everyone. We're going to get started today. I'm Sita Kedia. I'm a neurologist at Palm Health, and I'm excited to share with you information about keeping your brain in shape today. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my slides. Give me 1 second. You should be able to see the slides. If you cannot, please text in the chat box and we will see if we can fix that. But I think we should be in good shape. All right. So why do we care about keeping this organ, our brain, healthy? What are we trying to prevent? Is it Alzheimer's? Is it Parkinson's disease? Is it natural aging? These are some of the inherent fears that we struggle with as we age. Perhaps you have a loved one or a friend with MS or Parkinson's or dementia. So our question now is, what is our brain's trajectory? What is our own trajectory? And can we change this path? And what is the inevitable destiny of our brain? So let's start with what our brain is responsible for. As you know, there are different compartments in our brain. There are different lobes. So where the specific functions of our brain lie in these lobes. For instance, our temporal lobe, which is right here on the other side of our ear, it is responsible for our hearing, our language, understanding. So let's take a really great demonstration of what our human brain is really capable of. So this is one end of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. And so you want to think about what Michelangelo was thinking and had to do and was capable of to create such a masterpiece. What were the functions of the brain that allowed this to happen? So looking at the Sistine Chapel, we can see firsthand the human capacity to problem solve and plan from our frontal lobes, listen and communicate with all of his apprentices using his temporal lobes. And we had to be able to feel the texture of the walls, the ceilings using the parietal lobes. And then he had to be able to look at the colors and contours and shapes and figures he was drawing using his occipital lobe. With his cerebellum, he needed to balance and coordinate his hands and his legs to be able to climb the scaffoldings up to the ceiling and stand upright for hours at a time painting. This amazing capability of the brain is what allows humans to fully express, problem solve, hear, see, feel, move, balance, and experience fear and happiness and hunger and fatigue and joy. Well, these all come from the brain. Even negative emotions come from a healthy functioning of the brain. So, what is our brains made up of? And what makes all this happen? Well, the truth is it's comprised of neurons and then a whole bunch of cells that support and nourish those neurons. One of the key areas is in the brain is really at that synapse, which is the connection between two neighboring neurons. And at this connection, that is the synapse. This is where the communication between two neurons is happening. This is where humans think, feel, remember, reason. So, well, what are some of the ways that the synapse fails us? Or one might say we fail our synapse. So for demonstration purposes, today we're going to focus on Alzheimer's, which is fitting because it's Alzheimer's and Brain Awareness Month. So you can see here, here's the typical neuron. One neuron connecting to another neuron. An electrical signal will come down the neuron and it will cause these vesicles that contain acetylcholine to attach to this end of the neuron and release the acetylcholine into the synapse. The neighboring neuron has these receptors that catch and connect with this acetylcholine. And this chemical signal causes a cascade of events in this neighboring neuron to then send an electrical signal down. And this is how this electrical chemical signal transmits between two neurons. Well, amyloid beta naturally gets created by our brains. We don't really fully understand its purpose too well, but in general, we don't want amyloid beta around. And it's a byproduct of another process that we do want in our brain. This amyloid beta comes into the synapse. If you're over the age of 40, this is already happening in your brain. Amyloid beta is starting to aggregate in your brain. What happens is that we have these support cells, these nourishing cells, but they're also janitor cells that clean up this amyloid beta. And so as it accumulates, it tries to keep up with this accumulation. Over time, we may make too much of this amyloid beta, or we don't have enough cells to help clean up the amyloid beta, and there reaches a tipping point where the neuron can't handle the amyloid beta in the synapse, and it collapses and dies. Loss of one or two neurons is not a problem. However, over time, we may start to lose more and more, and that's when our memory becomes impacted. So let's all start by remembering any vivid trip that you went on recently. Where was it? Was it a vacation recently in the last 2-3 years? Where did you travel? Who did you go with? What details can you remember? Now, tell me what you had for breakfast last Wednesday, a week ago. Why do we remember certain things but not others? Why is our memory selective? Well, we're constantly forgetting. We're forgetting throughout the day, throughout the days. So think about the breakfast that you had perhaps last Wednesday. Let's say you were eating oatmeal, coffee, reading your newspaper, chatting with your son at the breakfast table. Well, over the next few days, let's say you are working on a huge presentation at work and you are working with your team, rehearsing that. Your brain doesn't find your oatmeal or your coffee or your newspaper all that interesting. And so it tends to forget. So now in a few days, when someone asks you to remember that Wednesday morning, you're going to barely remember it. So there's lots of different types of memory. There's the memory that happens within seconds, what you just remembered, what happened just fleeting it, what happened on the last slide. Then there's the working memory, which is what we hold in our brain and we do something with it, with that information. And then we have our long-term memory. So I'm gonna do a memory game with you all. So I want you to listen to 5 words. And then after I'm done saying them, I want you to recall them by saying them out loud. You guys are on mute, so don't worry. And here we go. Dog, cow, pig, owl, ape. Say them out loud. Now, listen to 5 words and recall them in alphabetical order. I'm going to say the same ones. Dog, cow, pig, owl, ape. Not as easy. It takes you a little bit more time. So why is the alphabetical order harder? Well, it requires intense concentration. It has heavy demands on our working memory, and it's harder for older individuals. So there's 3 kind of main stages of memory. We have to take the information and we have to encode it in our brain. Then we need to store it for later use. And then when we need it, we need to retrieve that information. Storage capacity is not the issue. Our brain is not an overloaded hard drive. It is rather when we have difficulty with encoding and retrieving information. So distraction and interference are going to hurt our encoding process. And then slower processing is going to hurt our retrieval. Memory needs to be distinguished from cognition. So we have key cognitive domains, and this includes memory, but it also includes our executive function with planning and strategy, having social cognition, having insight, picking up on social cues, knowing when it isn't appropriate to say something, knowing when it is, concentration, complex attention, which we just did, and then recalling certain things in our past and then the learning of those things, of skills. Language, we sometimes don't think about it, but word finding, grammar, fluency, this is all part of our cognition. And one of the hardest things as we age is word finding. And then we have our psychomotor speed and accuracy, and just the movement and our ability to actually think about something and then doing it. So for scientists, I've put in these little branching system, but what's important here is really focusing on this bottom portion. And there's all these different components of memory. We have our episodic memory, which is really remembering our first day of school, knowing the capital of France, which is our facts, being able to learn how to ride a bike, being more likely to use a word that you recently heard, and then salivating when you see your favorite food. These are all different aspects of memory. So let's take episodic memory. And this is something that we've done. It's, think about something in our recent past or your first day of your school, where your high school graduation was. What did you eat for breakfast yesterday? What neighbors were on your block when you grew up? What movie did you see on that first date with your wife or a husband? These events and experiences tend to worsen as we age. But if you have a strong emotion, positive or negative with them, you'll have a more vivid memory of them. So this is that example at the beginning of our presentation about vacation. A lot of times we have a lot of positive emotions around a vacation, or there's key events that it's around, a birthday or anniversary. Those are going to help store those memories into your brain and allow you to retrieve them later on. This is thanks to our frontal lobes and our hippocampus. Over time, these tend to worsen with age. Semantic memory, which are facts and concepts. So this is the color of the sky, the capital of the US, how to form a sentence. You can rattle those off really quickly. When John F. Kennedy was shot. This is what makes people wise. So as you think about it, as individuals grow older, they retain all that history and they're able to really tell you the details of events in the past. And vocabulary tends to get better as we get older. Names and naming is a different component, even though it is a part of our facts, it's really a different component and it can be particularly difficult. And many people report in their 40s. For me, it started in my 30s where names were, I guess, all my life, but names were never particularly easy for me. This is a different compartment in our brain. So skills and learning like brushing your teeth, riding a bike, driving a car, buttoning your shirt, all of these things are going to be the same whether you're younger or you're older. But what is interesting to know is that as you learn new skills, older individuals are going to need a little bit more repetition, a little bit more practice. So think about perhaps learning yourself how to use an iPad and having your son, your daughter, your grandchild teach you how to use an iPad. They can pick it up really quickly, but you may not be able to do that. So it's inevitable to have changes in our brain over time. Our brain volume peaks in our early 20s. Neurons shrink and atrophy. We lose dendritic connections, and we have less blood flow to the brain. This might leave you lost and confused and disoriented, but I hope not. So I show this to all my patients in my office visits. This is an important concept to remember, to think about. And so I'll draw this out, usually in my chicken scratch on the back of a piece of paper. On the y-axis, we have cognitive function. And on the x-axis, we have years. And we have normal aging. So when we're born, we have the skyrocketing in the first 2 decades of life in our cognitive functions and abilities. And a lot of people think that in their 20s and maybe in their 30s is kind of their prime. And then we have this normal aging, but you can see this normal aging here in green and yellow, they're quite different in their slope. And so we have the capacity to change how we age and how our brain changes over time. And so you could be here, but that doesn't mean that you can't get yourself up to a higher level. You could be here and you can get yourself back up to here. And so this is what we're going to really be talking about, is how do we change this trajectory? What's also important to really distinguish is the pathway to dementia. And so there's this one line called precognitive decline. And this is really important because a lot of people, a subset of my patients, will come to me and say, I'm having memory difficulties. But then when I test them, I'm not seeing anything on their tests. So I'll do standardized testing. And this is where an individual will notice changes, but we can't detect them in the office. And so it's a stage when the patient knows that there's something wrong, but the doctor really doesn't. And that's common. I myself will admit to it because we just don't have the capability of detecting those in some of our testing. Then we may progress into something called mild cognitive impairment. Mild cognitive impairment is when cognitive changes occur that are a concern to you as a patient or to family members around them, or both. And this is when more than one cognitive domain is usually starting to be impacted. But ADLs, which are activities of daily living, stay preserved. And with activities of daily living, what those are getting up and going and taking a shower and picking out your clothes for the day, going down and making your breakfast for the day and not leaving the stove on, going to the grocery store, planning a trip, going to work, and being able to get to your office without getting lost. So activities of daily living are preserved in mild cognitive impairment. Individuals are still working, they're driving, but I can pick it up on an exam, on my standardized test, and your loved ones and yourself know that there's something going on. And then the progression into dementia, which is the slope down here. This is where cognitive impairment becomes severe enough in multiple domains where it starts to impact everyday abilities. So you do get lost going to the grocery store, or you get turned around in the grocery store. You have difficulty remembering that you've started something in the kitchen and then you've walked away and you forgot that you left the stove on. So these activities of daily living are now affected and are interfering with your ability to function day to day with your normal routine. And this is what we're all trying to prevent. I don't think that there's anyone in the country or the world that doesn't want to prevent this. Dementia is an umbrella term. And so there are a lot of different disorders that fall into dementia, Alzheimer's being the most common. About 60 to 70% of dementias are going to be Alzheimer's, then followed by vascular dementia. So vascular dementia is when somebody's having high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, and the vessels that deliver oxygen and blood flow to the brain are starting to be impaired, and you get impact on the brain and the brain matter. And you can actually see this on an MRI. And then there's a lot of other types of dementias, like dementia with Lewy body and frontotemporal and so forth. So my job as a neurologist is to help kind of determine, where do I think you fall? And this is using a very traditional hat. And we're going to talk a little about later about kind of what do we do when we have somebody who's having memory impairment, to look at them from a root cause standpoint, from a functional standpoint. Well, when you have dementia, there's not one symptom early on that we can say this is what is a symptom or a sign of dementia. There are so many different ones, and it's usually not until multiple of these start to be seen that we really start to see the impact, and then it becomes to the attention of loved ones, yourself, and also to your doctor. So there's not one symptom or sign, and it really can be a wide range and a broad array. What are the factors that increase dementia risk? And I feel like every physician with whatever disease they're talking about is going to put 5 or 6 of these on their slide when it comes to factors that increase the risk of whatever disease: blood pressure, diabetes and sugar, overweight, especially that abdominal weight that we carry is particularly associated with dementia and other cardiovascular diseases, inflammation, cholesterol. But what I want to particularly impress upon you for dementia is sleep quality, prolonged stress, trauma, genetics, and a sedentary lifestyle. And we're going to talk about some of these. So I want you to look and think about yourself. Do you have any of these? How many do you have? I don't want you to become a prisoner to our own aging body. This isn't the moment to do that. So I want to play a video on the next slide. And of course, with technical difficulties, we'll see how we go. Let's see how we do. And this is not Nigel Lester, one of our psychiatrists.
This is Pager. He's a 9-year-old macaque who had a Neuralink placed in each side of his brain about 6 weeks ago. If you look carefully, you can see that the fur on his head hasn't quite fully grown back yet. He's learned to interact with a computer for a tasty banana smoothie delivered through a straw. We can interact with the Neuralinks simply by pairing them to an iPhone, just as you might pair your phone to a Bluetooth speaker. The links record from more than 2,000 electrodes implanted in the regions of Pager's motor cortex that coordinate hand and arm movements. Neurons in this region modulate their activity with intended hand movement. For example, some might become more active when he moves his hand up, and others when he moves it to the right. By recording from many neurons and feeding their activity into a decoder algorithm, we are able to predict Pager's intended hand movements in real time. First, we calibrate the decoder by recording neural activity as Pager uses the joystick to move a cursor to targets presented on the screen. As he's playing this game, we are wirelessly streaming in real time the firing rates from thousands of neurons to a computer. Using these data, we calibrate the decoder by mathematically modeling the relationship between patterns of neural activity and the different joystick movements they produce. After only a few minutes of calibration, we can use the output from the decoder to move the cursor instead of the joystick. Pager still moves the joystick out of habit, but as you can see, it's unplugged. He's controlling the cursor entirely with decoded neural activity. Our goal is to enable a person with paralysis to use a computer or phone with their brain activity alone. Because they wouldn't be able to move a joystick, they would calibrate the decoder by imagining hand movements to targets. One of the things the Neuralinks allow Pager to do is to play his favorite video game, Pong. To control his paddle on the right side of the screen, Pager simply thinks about moving his hand up or down. We've removed the joystick altogether. Now that he's up to speed, let's increase the difficulty and see how well Pager can play with the Neuralink. As you can see, Pager is amazingly good at mind Pong. He's focused, and he's playing entirely of his own volition. It's not magic. The reason Neuralink works is because it's recording and decoding electrical signals from the brain. Great game, Pager. And what better reward for a monkey than a banana?
All right. So I really think that this video demonstrates, and although it's using Neuralink, which is a specific brain computer interface, it helps us really understand how neuroplasticity can work and how we can learn over time what our neurons really truly are capable of. So I want to empower you that, do you want to be the chimp on the left, laying back and letting life happen? Or do you want to be the one on the right who's going to be active and an active participant? So I empower everyone to meet me at the starting line. And whether you are 30, 60, 80, you can do this. And this is what we're going to talk about, is what are the things that we can do to help with our neuroplasticity, to keep us from aging in a way where our brain is shrinking, and what can we be doing for our neurons. So let's get started with the items that we always talk about. It's very common that individuals ask, well, what can I do to help prevent dementia? I already have mild cognitive impairment. What are the things I can do to keep me from going on the track to dementia? And there are so many things that we can do, but I really want to lay that foundation of what are the most important items on this kind of pyramid of all of these things that we can do. And as we do with everything in Palm Health, we really want individuals to really find that meaning and purpose, joy and deep satisfaction in life in their day-to-day activities. And that is always going to be at the foundation of everything that we want to promote. And then we want exercise, nutrition, sleep, and stress. You're going to hear it time and time again. People always wonder, why do I go to the doctor's office? And they always just talk to me about exercise, nutrition, sleep, and stress. Well, there's a reason. They're all the lifestyle things that we know, that we are 100% certain impact our disease states and our chronic illnesses that we may have over time. So let's start with exercise. Why is that important? We know that it increases blood flow. It increases oxygen to the brain, but it also increases the nutrient delivery to the brain and helps flush the bad stuff out of the brain. So we want to be nourishing our cells with that blood flow, and we want to be active. And so how are we active? And a lot of people say that they walk their dog. It's great. I'm glad that they have a dog and that they're walking it outside and getting outside. But that's not the level of activity we're talking about, unless you're really going for about 45 minutes to an hour with that dog and doing 2 to 3 miles. That's going to be really average level of activity. So most people's average is here, and we need to move people's average into this spot. This average is really having daily activity that, if it's not in your occupation or your day-to-day habits, then you need to set aside an hour a day where you're going to be active. And that doesn't have to be intense exercise. That can really be moderate exercise where you can really sustain it for 45 minutes to an hour. And it can be things like gardening or doing a lot of housework around the house can be very active, but it needs to be sustained and it needs to be mindful. Then I empower individuals to get to this level of high level of activity at least 3 times, and if you can, 5 times a week of at least 30 minutes. And this is where your heart is pounding, you're feeling out of breath, you're a little sweaty. We want to get to that level, because when we know that we're at that level, we're really truly exercising our heart, but we're getting what we need to our brain. Nutrition. One concept that I always stress to individuals is making sure they're eating the rainbow. And so a lot of people get in a little bit of a rut and eat the same color vegetables, whether they're green or they're yellow, but they don't have a variety in their day. And so I want everyone to eat the rainbow, because those phytonutrients that you're getting from all these different colors of foods is going to really impact your chemical processes in your brain to make energy, as well as help your metabolism and help nourish the brain. The second concept that I like to stress is intermittent fasting. And so there's different ways to do intermittent fasting, but what I find to work well from the majority of my patients is to start eating at 9 o'clock in the morning. So if you look here, at 9 o'clock in the morning will be your first meal, and you're going to eat whatever you want, healthy, throughout the day. And You want to have whole grains. You want to eat healthy fats. You want to have good sources of protein, a nice balanced meal. And then at 7 p.m., you're done. You're not going to have anything. You've cleaned up from dinner. You've started putting your dishes away. And now you're going to start your period of fasting. And that period of fasting is going to be a total of 14 hours now. What is key is that the 3 hours before bedtime, you are still fasting. That you're not just eating right up until bedtime and then you lay down and you go to sleep. That is terrible for our metabolism and it's terrible for our brains. So we really want to get into that fasting period. Fasting is really important, not only for glucose and insulin control and cholesterol, but it also stimulates something called autophagy. When we're starting to produce those ketone bodies in our body as we get into that fasting. And that autophagy is really what's going to help clean up the cellular debris and the bad things that we're making throughout the day of eating and that stress that we're putting on our system. There's lots of other things that we can counsel you in your office. There's things called a ketogenic diet or the on the prolonged intermittent prolonged fasting mimicking diet. There's a lot of other things you can do, but this kind of intermittent fasting of 14 hours is something people can do most days of the week, if not all days of the week. And others will do maybe 16 hours or 18 hours of fasting. Those are a little bit harder to sustain for longer periods of time. This is really a lifestyle change. Let's change it where every day this is your habit. You're done by 7, and then you start again at 9 o'clock in the morning. Sleep. So we know that sleep is important. And I know that so many people struggle with sleep. And it's particularly as we've gone through COVID, we've noticed a lot more individuals develop sleep difficulties and insomnia around the stress and anxiety around COVID. And so we know how important sleep is for the consolidation of memories. But it actually is also not just the quantity of sleep, but the quality of sleep. We really need to get into the deep stages of sleep because that is when we're cleaning up house. We're cleaning up the metabolic waste. This has been shown over and over again that when we're awake, we don't have as much metabolic waste clearance. And so when you compare it to sleep, particularly deep stages of sleep, we see a process called lymphatic flow. So if you see lymphatic has lymphatic, so if you think of detoxification with our lymphatic system, this is what we've termed glymphatic, which is when during sleep, we have more metabolic waste clearance and also that amyloid beta that we were talking about earlier. This is when that is cleared. So we want to have that restful sleep. And what is really particularly important is that sleep medications, actually some of them do not get you into the deep stages of sleep and can increase the risk of dementia. So they followed large populations of individuals over time, and those who were taking chronic uses of sleep medications and sleep aids were at a higher risk of dementia. And that's why we like to promote natural ways of getting our sleep regulation under control. So sleep hygiene. And there's so many things to go in sleep hygiene that we could have a whole talk on sleep hygiene. And we've actually had one in the past with Dr. Rathod. So if you haven't seen that, definitely check that one out. But the thing that I want to stress the importance of, things like melatonin, they're not going to change your deep stages of sleep. Some of these natural elements that we can use, we use valerian root or something called botanicum that can be really helpful, which are herbal ways to help you sleep if you're particularly struggling, in addition to some sleep hygiene. So we got exercise, nutrition, and sleep, and let's talk about stress. So we all know a little bit of stress is okay. We know that a little bit of stress is going to help us actually perform better. But it's when we have too much stress that we start to have panic and anxiety, and we start to develop too much cortisol in our system. And we then begin having adrenal fatigue, and we get sick, and we start to have disease. So what is stress overload? I like this definition that Dr. Del Faro used in her talk on what is the psychological definition, which is stress overload is what we feel when the demands imposed on us exceed our ability to cope with them. And this can be a psychological definition, but this can also be a physiological or a physical. It could be in elite athletes, it could be with stress from chronic illness, or just the impact of what we're eating every day and having what we call our standard American diet. And we can see this both physiologically and psychologically. So what can we do about it? One of the things that we like to do is measure it with heart rate variability. So there's this system of our parasympathetic and our sympathetic, and these systems need to be in balance. Our parasympathetic system is our rest and our digest, it's our calming, and our sympathetic, which is our fight and flight. These systems are always need to be in balance. We need both of them. Heart rate variability helps us to know whether we're a little bit out of balance. If you look at the general population, we're all a little bit sympathetically dominant. So sympathetically dominant is going to give you an erratic heart rate variability. So if you look at here on the y-axis, we have our heart rate, and then this is time over time. Our heart rate isn't stiff. It's not a stiff beating of kind of a drum keeping to a beat. It's going to have variability. That is normal. We want there to be variability. And so it can be kind of slow and a little bit fast and a little bit slow over time. But what happens is that it can become really incoherent if that sympathetic system is really out of balance with our parasympathetic. And in this, we just get this really chaotic appearance of our heart rate from moment to moment. And in this incoherence, we know that we're going to have increased frustration, anxieties, worry, and irritation. Well, those then in themselves increase our sympathetic system and then cause the perpetual change. What we can do is we can get into coherence. So when we have this really beautiful sinusoidal, non-chaotic, coherent heart rate variability, we're going to have more positive emotions. We're going to appreciate ourselves and appreciate others. We're going to have more love and caring of others. And so with certain breathing techniques, you can learn how to become more coherent. Right before I came onto this presentation, I practiced my cardiac coherent breathing that I learned, and I was able to calm myself before I started, and I was able to be less anxious. So we really want people to be practicing this day to day, not just when they're stressed, but then to be able to use this when they're stressed. We have our foundation. The next step is going to be really social engagement and support. It is key for individuals as they age to have a really solid network of family and friends around them, to be part of community centers that are promoting health and healing, where you can be around others who have the same mindset and who are going to be positive influences on you, to have a really nurturing family and connections with those that you love and some friends. So I really think that that social engagement is really going to help people have more meaning and purpose and joy and deep satisfaction in their life. And it's also helpful for our neuronal connections and helping for our neuroplasticity. So then talking about neuroplasticity, we need to be exercising our brain. We need to be challenging ourselves with learning something new and reading a book. But I challenge you not to just read a book that you are familiar or comfortable with. So if you're a history professor and you normally read history books, don't pick up a history book. Pick up something different. Pick up an art book. Pick up a book on something to learn how to learn a new hobby. So we have to get out of our comfort zone. And with getting out of our comfort zone, we are going to start building those connections in our brain. And getting out of our comfort zone, we are going to be promoting neuroplasticity. So an example that I give a lot of my patients is learning a new language, learning an instrument, learn a new hobby. So during COVID, I do ceramics, I do scrapbooking, but I wanted to do something new and work on something new that was challenging. And I wanted to learn how to do acrylic painting. So I'd done a little bit of water painting, but I didn't really know how to do acrylic painting. So I started watching some YouTube videos. I started reading some books, some blogs. Then I went to the art store. And the first time I was a little bit intimidated, and I walked around a few times, got my bearings, and I left. I read a little bit more, and then I went back and I started talking to some of the sales agents, and they helped me figure out what I needed and kind of narrowed down my approach. I had my list, and then I was able to go home and paint my first acrylic painting, watching a YouTube video and kind of following along. And so you might not be good at it, but that's not what matters. It's about how you tried. And it involves so many different complex parts of your brain to be able to plan and execute a new hobby. All of that reading and then planning and executing is going to really help that neuroplasticity. So we want to protect against dementia. We've talked a lot about a lot of these, but I also like to stress volunteering. And why I think volunteering is really helpful is when we're in the service of others, we're really going to be in a better state. We're going to have a lot more resiliency in ourselves, and we're going to have more meaning and purpose. So if you wanted to come up with another activity, maybe it is volunteering, and you're going to learn something new. If you're going to put yourself in a volunteering position, I'm sure you're going to be around new people and new things and new concepts. So now we're getting on to the micronutrients. And micronutrients, we've talked about some of this, which is eating the rainbow. And we want to get all our variety of vitamins and minerals. But we also want to key on a couple of specific ones. And I always talk to my patients about omega-3 fatty acids. So this is anti-inflammatory. It's going to protect our cell membranes and just cellular protection in general. But what individuals want to a lot of times ask me is which type of omega-3 fatty acids. So I like this diagram because it really shows that we have plant-based and we have marine-based omega-3 fatty acids. So your plant-based are going to be your flax, chia, and walnuts. And although these are important and can be helpful, it's really these marine-based, particularly DHA. DHA is going to be the omega fatty acid that's going to get into the brain. And so we're going to get it from fish oil, krill oil, or algae, but you can also take supplements of it. So I want you to look at, if you're going to take one thing, is look at your omega-3 fatty acids that you might be getting in your bottle and make sure that you're getting enough DHA. And so this is what's going to really protect against aging. And it's the one specific supplement that I think is really helpful. One thing to note is there are very purified types of omega-3 fatty acids, which we also carry at Palm, which don't give you necessarily the difficulties if you have a seafood allergy. So I really would love you to, if you do have a seafood allergy, you can work with your doctor and come up with ways to test that particular supplement and see if you have a reaction to it by taking it and then potentially having some Benadryl in the office, in the physician's office, and keep doing kind of a test dose in the office with your physician. And so I've had some patients do that, and then they were able to tolerate those omega-3 fatty acids. The other is vitamin D. We know that vitamin D is associated with so many diseases now. And I definitely think that it's something that we really need to be thinking about with Alzheimer's and dementia. And particularly if you take it with curcumin, it's going to help fight against those plaques. So curcumin is the active ingredient for turmeric, and you can find just curcumin. And you want to make sure you get bioabsorbable types of curcumin. Not all curcumins are the same. Many curcumins don't get actually absorbed into your system. And so then it's really not worth taking it. So when it comes to vitamin D, you really want a level when you get your vitamin D checked with your blood and with your doctor above 50, around 50 to 70. So above 30 is considered technically normal, but we really want individuals to be about 50 to 70 on their level. And so if you're about 30 or 40, you can go ahead and take about 2,000 units a day to kind of keep you where you are and boost it up to about 50 to 60. If you're below 30, you really need to be on 5,000, and you should be really taking it with K2. So supplements will come with K2D3, and that K2D3 that K2 is going to really help optimize that vitamin D. There's so many micronutrients to talk about, and you can work with your physician to help you know which micronutrients you really should be honing in on. But those are the ones that I like to definitely make sure that you know about today as a take-home point. So, optimization. This is what really individuals come into my office for, is what can we be doing to be looking at micronutrients and optimizing and looking oxidative stress and looking at the genetics. So we're going to always, and I didn't want to take these three or four off of the slide because those are so essential to what we do day to day. But how do we optimize? And this is where functional medicine comes into place. And so with functional medicine and functional analysis, we're going to go kind of beyond what you normally get with a traditional pathway. And so we may look at different root causes, and depending on your history, we're going to look at micronutrients, metabolic analysis of our energy pathways. Our brain is constantly using energy, and we need to be able to take fats, sugars, and proteins that we're eating and convert them into energy. And that takes a lot of metabolic processes, vitamins and minerals and cofactors. And we can actually examine those pathways and see where you might have difficulties. Is it with amino acids? Is it with fatty acids? Is it about getting those fatty acids into the mitochondria and creating energy? So there's a lot of different things there. And we can also look at your level of cellular and oxidative stress. Brain gut, we want to look at leaky gut, the microbiome, something called SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Our gut is the foundation for our body, and we have to start with our gut. And if we can improve leaky gut microbiome, our microbiome, and SIBO, we're going to go a long way. We're going to improve our brain fog. We're going to improve our memory. And then we may also do advanced lipid and cardiometabolic analysis and genetic analysis. So when somebody, as like myself, as a functional neurologist, when I see somebody who is particularly worried about their memory or particularly worried about a family member with dementia, or they have a family member with dementia and they don't want to go down that same path, we're going to examine them and see which bucket they may fall into. And there's a lot of different buckets that somebody may have that are their contributors to dementia or memory difficulties or even Parkinson's or MS. And those could be glucose and insulin and cardiometabolic issues. That could be vascular issues. It could be repetitive trauma. It could be toxins. So there's so many different, it can be hormones. There are so many different pathways, and that's kind of that functional optimization. But it's really that icing on the cake. We really need to remember that foundation. So one part of this icing on the cake is really to understand oxidative stress. This oxidative stress damages neurons and accelerates the aging process. And so why this is important is that we need to look at this balance. We're constantly producing reactive oxygen species in our brain. These are happening all over our body and in our brain from normal metabolic processes and normal processes. We might have an infection. We might eat something that's just not that great. We might have a piece of steak that's a little bit charcoaled. There's a lot of different things, but you can see all the different factors that create these reactive oxygen species. Our body naturally produces antioxidants. We also consume antioxidants, vitamin C being the number one antioxidants that we consume. What happens is that when we have too much of this stuff in the middle, we tip the scales, and our antioxidants can't keep up with all the reactive oxygen species that we're creating. And so we need to help tip the balance, put it back in balance. And so we want to remove some of these factors as much as we can. We can also do things like taking extra vitamin C, something called N-acetylcysteine, glutathione. Glutathione isn't something that we can actually consume in the foods that we eat. So we have to naturally make it, or we have to actually consume it as a supplement. And then, or you can also get it as an IV. Meditation is going to also tip this balance scale. So the next thing I wanted to stress upon is our neuroplasticity. So in addition to picking up a new hobby, we can also really examine what our brain is doing. So with an MRI, we're not going to be able to see the actual function of our brain with a standard MRI. What we can do is with an EEG, we can actually look at the brain waves. And so we have different brain waves. We have beta waves, which is going to be during really awake and mental activity while you're listening to us today. Alpha, which is going to be the awake and resting state. Theta is sleep, but also meditation. And then delta, which is going to be deep sleep. These brain waves are happening at all times of the day, whether we're awake or asleep, but it's just how predominant are they? And then what areas of the brain are they? What we can do is something called a QEEG, where we can look at that functioning of those brain waves, and we can look at those different patterns. And with this QEEG, you can see different patterns, and these patterns can be significant for anxiety, for depression, for ADHD, for PTSD, and it can also have concussion markers. There's a wide variety of different markers and patterns of these brain waves in these different regions of the brain that help us understand what might be contributing to your memory issues. I have a lot of people, they come to my office, they have memory difficulties, and we can't find anything on their standardized test. I do a QEEG, and they have so much ADHD patterns that it's just bright red, and you just wonder why they're not, why of course they're having these difficulties, or they have tons of anxiety, and that anxiety is hijacking the brain and causing individuals to feel like that they're having memory issues when it's really just really bad anxiety. So these patterns help us with that. Then you can actually do something about these brain waves. You can actually train these brain waves with neurofeedback to help balance them back into normal. So as we wrap up today, I want everyone to remember that cognition is what is truly important. So how do we preserve cognition and memory? Memory being a component of cognition. So anytime you think of the brain, I want you to be thinking about all of these things that you can do and why it's important. So think of our brain as this beautiful tree. The trunk and branches all represent the blood supply to the brain. And the leaves are all the neurons that allow the beautiful communication to happen. Over time, if we're not supplying the brain with all this nourishment and all these different things that we just spoke about, the leaves are going to slowly die off and thin. So another demonstration that I like to see is these neurons you can see here on the left don't have a lot of connections. They're not very robust. And so as you learn something, as you use your neuroplasticity to help get yourself to this is when you have connections between neurons that are vibrant, they're plentiful, and you can see that the cells themselves look a lot more nourished. And so what we know is that when neural pathways fire, the stronger these connections begin. And so neurons that fire together wire together. And that's something that's a motto in my life, is constantly working on something called long-term potentiation, which is the basis for learning and memory formation. And this is really what we're really trying to promote within you with all these different activities and all these things that you need to do for your health. And so I leave you with this simple but important picture. And I hope that you're able to get to the starting line with me and start working on your brain health. Thank you so much.